do good social justice work abroad. And I was like, well, where would a good Jewish boy go to do meaningful, work in the world? It's like, well, obviously a good Jewish boy would go do that in Israel. So I'm going to go to Israel and I'm going to do work between Jews and Palestinians and we're going to solve the conflict. I'll come back home and we'll be like done with this, like no problem. Uh,
So I would like to welcome today Ben Murain. My guest today is the director of the New Israel Fund in Canada. And I think it is very beneficial for everyone in the Arabic community and maybe in the Jewish community as well, but definitely in the Arabic community to get to know, to understand what Ben and his colleagues are involved in. So, Ben, without further ado, tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll go into the New Israel Fund.
Thanks, Ahmed. I'm really delighted to be interviewed here. I think this initiative of yours is really, really needed and really, really necessary. So thank you for doing it.
Thank you.
I was entertained in your last podcast when you gave the anecdote about receiving a piece of fundraising mail from the New Israel Fund, and your wife said, "Oh no, what are you doing?"
And
Well,
if my mom is listening, I didn't give this guy any money. All right, just so you know, not yet, at least.
um, uh, just by way of introducing myself, I know what you wanted to get into is not only the New Israel Fund, but also like some contour and depth about like what the Canadian Jewish community looks like. And I think uh, my own story is helpful in kind of exploding some of the preconceptions about who Jews are and what we are, and so like just for example, I consider myself an unusual Jew to be in this seat doing like as a Jewish communal professional for almost 20 years now. And I've been working for New Israel Fund for 15 years, since 2008. And the reason is because is actually like I don't have a lot of Jewish DNA, and I actually did not grow up in a big Jewish community. So my roots are that my grandfather, my one born Jewish grandparent, came from Poland. He fled before the war and couldn't get into North America. But he, as the tale goes, hid on a boat or got some stowed away and got into Central America. He settled in Costa Rica. And there he met and married my grandmother, who was a native Costa Rican Catholic, and had my three aunts, Etty, Scheindel, and Tema. So my family's like native mother tongue is really Spanish. And then they moved in 1950 to Los Angeles, and that's where my mom was born, Fega. And so they grew up in like a Yiddish, English, Spanish, recent immigrants household in the greater Los Angeles area. And flash forward a little bit, and my mom marries my dad, who's from a little town near Yellowstone, or and he's the very proud descendant. His family is very proud of being descendants of Spanish conquistadors who like founded the San Francisco Mission and married like native Salinas Indian families all the way down for many generations. So actually, 3/4 of my DNA is arguably Catholic. And yet I was raised Jewish, and when my parents married, my mom was very clear: I'll take your last name if you'll take my religion. And my dad did convert at a later age, and he had a job that put us in places that weren't with very large Jewish populations. He was in the American Army, and so we left California when I was little, and we lived in Oklahoma and Colorado and Nebraska and Texas and a few other places. And they ultimately, retired in Oregon, where my family still lives. And in many of those places, I was the only Jewish person for hundreds of miles in every direction. But I was intensely aware that I was a Jewish minority, even if I was not meeting a lot of other Jews. And so I think my quest to find my people, who are my people, what do we stand for, what are we doing in the world, what are we accomplishing, began with the bookcase, the Jewish bookcase in my household. All the books about Jewish ethics and morals and Torah and folklore. And it put me on a quest to try and meet Jews later in life, which didn't help that I went to a Jesuit Catholic university, And I was, again, one of the only Jewish people. And I landed on campus like weeks after 9/11. And at that time, everything was about the Middle East. The quest was like, what is the relationship between America and the Middle East, and America and Israel? And the Second Intifada was raging. And because I was one of the only Jewish people on my campus, I was basically default rabbi. People expected me to have all the answers about who are Jews and what is Jewishness and why is Israel doing what it was doing. And I, like many other people, young Jews at that time, we have a strong connection, an emotional connection to Israel, but we don't know a lot about it. And as we begin learning about it, the things that our parents taught us, the things that we stand for, are not matching up per se to like what we see in the news. And that began my story, where I began learning more, and I felt like I was always on the defensive. And there are things as a progressive person that my parents raised me to be progressive that I didn't see reflected in Israel. And that became the internal conflict, which I think, flash forward, ultimately propelled me to really lean in and do it.
So you're saying there was a distance between the values you grew up on and some of the actions of some people that you would think, no, that's not our values.
Yeah, and I'll give you an example, and this is where it kind of transitions into
Yeah, please,
learning
because
more
like
about the
my
Jewish
name is
conflict.
Ahmed Khalifa. I'm Muslim. I have no idea what you're talking about. Like I have never faced that conflict in my life. Please elaborate on that, because like I don't know. I did not spend half my life saying no, this is not true.
Well, like I really wanted to see it for myself. So like a few years into university, I was like, well, all my friends are going to, Catholic worker houses or Mother Teresa's, order in India or South America or Africa. They're going to go do good social justice work abroad. And I was like, well, where would a good Jewish boy go to do meaningful, work in the world? So, well, obviously a good Jewish boy would go do that in Israel. So I'm going to go to Israel and I'm going to do work between Jews and Palestinians, and we're going to solve the conflict. I'll come back home and we'll be like done with this, like no problem. And so like let's just say, as an example, I go and I do a bunch of volunteering with different places, and I'm really naive. Like I really, have very little lived experience with Israel or Israelis by this point. But I land in Israel and I go to volunteer in places where they're doing Jewish Arab work together. And so I landed at a Bedouin camp in the edge of East Jerusalem. This is a corrugated aluminum shanty town of the Jahalin tribe. And it's on the Palestinian side of East Jerusalem, at the bottom of the mountain, in the West Bank. And it's got no power, no water. The kids mostly don't have shoes. Like they live with their goats and their animals. They're located next to a garbage dump. Up the hill is the sort of Arab side of East Jerusalem. It's just a sprawl. And up the other side they're in a valley, up the other mountain is the giant settlement of Ma'ala Adumim. It's the biggest settlement in the West Bank. And it looks like the Towers of Babylon. It's like big, tall, white walls and green roofs, and there's rec centers and pools and lush green gardens, and there's a Library of Peace in there. And I just remember standing in the middle of it, confused. Like, this doesn't make sense. And this wasn't on the Birthright brochures. I only did Birthright way later, but this did not look like the high-tech wonders that I had been sold on. And every day I would have to cross the checkpoints in order to get to this Bedouin camp. And every day I would see an IDF Jeep parked to the side of a big pile of rubble that just meant that cars couldn't get through a street. And men and women crossing it, and kids going to school, and old ladies with their groceries, and men in their business suits. And I remember on a day in which a female suicide bomber blew herself up in French Hill, another neighborhood, I saw nothing different at the checkpoint. I didn't see, people weren't being frisked, people weren't being, wanded or x-rayed. There was something about this whole experience, and the way that this whole experience was enormously confusing. What am I looking at? And I continued to do volunteering with the Bedouin, and I did volunteering with organizations that dealt with what was happening in East Jerusalem, what continues to happen in East Jerusalem about Palestinians trying to get permits to build their houses and their houses being knocked down and settlements going up instead and those sorts of things. And I did not know it at the time, but every organization I was a part of was funded or trained or connected to the New Israel Fund in some way.
Okay.
And the people I was with were Jewish Israelis and Palestinians of the territories working together on trying to make whatever it was we were looking at not as bad or better. Very Sisyphean, pushing a boulder uphill, given what I'm
So
describing.
they're not doing political work per se. They're just trying to make. They're looking at an unjust situation. I would describe it, where there is a great discrepancy between the rich and the poor, the haves and have-nots, and
And there was a
they're trying to break that barrier socially. They're not political. I mean,
no,
eventually that will be political. You cannot be unpolitical when you do that,
yeah.
but just a social work.
No, I think it's a little bit of both. My experience there, because I didn't know what I was seeing, was very focused on the conflict, and it was highly political, in the sense that all those issues are very political. As a side note, yeah, like I just felt that actually there's a bigger picture beyond just the conflict here. Like if we look at the socioeconomic equality, even discounting the ethnic conflict, there is enough inequality here to keep me working until the day that I die. Like this country is a normal country, and
And,
it's not
and
a
you
bad
describe
country.
something shocking for most people, because almost everyone think Israelis are, well, the settlements as you described them, well built, although the Arabic perspective would include like machine guns and settlers who are very violent. But the stereotype is we have the Israelis who are advanced and very well equipped, and the Palestinians who are steadfast in their resistance, and they are so unequipped, but they are so stubborn they would never give up whatever they want. But nobody talks about the slums. Like when we talk about Jerusalem, we see the old city and the dome, but nobody sees the Bedouins living in tents and slums, and it's very interesting, very interesting. But I don't want, like, we can spend hours talking about that trip by itself. But this is how you understood there was something called the New Israel Fund.
Yeah, and a number of years later, I would end up working for in New York for the New Israel Fund, and I've worked for them since 2008. And it was only then, when I would get back. I got back after that trip, and I was on fire. I was like the first person who ever discovered the occupation. I had to tell everybody about it, and I had some very patient rabbi mentors of mine who I would later discover had been donors to the New Israel Fund since before I was born. And that they were, the New Israel Fund, it was founded about over 40 years ago to be the bridge between expanding and growing Israeli civil society. So the women's movement, the environmental movement, the different kinds of Jewish immigrants all advocating for their rights, in Israel's early founding, Israel didn't like emerge from some Zionist dream with great gay rights and with women's rights. Like women weren't allowed to fly planes until the 70s and 80s. You could be fired for observing Jewish laws from your job, like taking the Sabbath off, because the labor laws were not strong enough. Like Israel is a country like any other that its accomplishments in terms of becoming a liberal democracy, such that they are imperfect, deeply flawed, and rather fragile, were fought by Israelis tooth and nail over the powers that be, the governments at the time, winning in court, passing laws that took many years to get through, and all of those things that we're proud of, defeating, in this time, like we just went through a year with all these democratic protests, and so I think people get now, in a way they didn't before, that democracy is something you accomplish. It's not something you just get. And a lot of those early victories were won by organizations funded by the New Israel Fund, trained by the New Israel Fund, or convened by the New Israel Fund. We are the gardener, if you could use that metaphor, of Israel's progressive civil society. So the groups that are the legal aid groups, the ACLU or the CCLA of Israel, the women's legal groups, the grassroots campaigning groups, and lots of the groups that we're now talking about with related to Israeli voices who are arguing for humanitarian aid, for Jewish-Arab partnership, for the human rights of Palestinians in the West Bank, trying to protect the two-state solution. These are NIF's community, and these are my colleagues and my peers. And what I've been doing for 15 years is trying to introduce them to mostly diaspora Jews. But I also think there's something really important that everybody should know, that there's these other voices in Israel too that believe in these values. And it's not necessarily, we cannot let Benjamin Netanyahu or his coalition partners, or even some of the people to the center, represent every Israeli. It is an enormously diverse society.
All right. So I think we established that there is a lot of common ground between anyone, not just in the Arab community, but anywhere in the world, or Canada specifically, who would. There is enough common ground with the New Israel Fund based on human rights, equality, and justice, based on the fact that we believe everyone deserves to live in dignity and freedom. And from there on, I believe I want to actually take the conversation away from the Middle East, because that conversation, so many people died on that hill. The reason I started this podcast and I wanted to talk to people was to build bridges between communities that seem to be fractured. And what is really sad for me is that there is way more in common between the two communities, in the fact that they are stereotyped by everyone outside them, just like every community is, right? And the fact that they are often misunderstood, to the point that when you talk to people about the internal working of the community, people are shocked. Like, a lot of people think like, oh, Arabs are very organized. It's like, I have never seen such an unorganized community in Canada like the Arabic community, because they come from 20 different countries, 25 different ethnic backgrounds, and multiple religions and factions and sects, and within each one of them different levels of belief and non-belief, and we don't have a history of accepting differences very easy, so we're really dispersed. Right? Like, it's very hard to have a birthday party, not to organize people around something. So maybe I would like to hear from you more about your understanding or reflection of the Canadian Jewish community as it relates to the Middle East, as it relates to the question of Palestine.
I'm a good person to talk about I'm a good person and a bad person to talk about the shape and contour of Canadian Jewry. Partly because I'm new and I'm learning, because I moved here in 2015. I'm now a citizen. My wife is Canadian Jewish. But I'm a good person to ask because, like I said, I grew up in these small towns, and it didn't matter where I went, what big Jewish community I lived in, whether it was New York or even Seattle or moving to Israel for a time and then moving to Toronto. I'm always the new kid, and I'm always curious about the way people describe themselves versus what data we have about them. And my palette was blank about Canadian Jews when I moved here also, and I wanted to know, like, do we have any data actually? And luckily, right after I began as the Canadian director for New Israel Fund here, in 2018, this large nonpartisan research institute called Environics, the Environics Institute, published the largest, most comprehensive study of Canadian Jews to date. And it was it was built as a reflection of the Pew study in the U.S., which is again one of the biggest of its time, and asked all kinds of things about how did Canadian Jews constitute their identity. It asked questions about Israel also, but it asked questions totally not related to Israel. That was not the major focus of it. And so for the first time, Canadian Jews had a much more in-depth understanding of themselves, and they also had like a comparative questions for American Jews, so that we could see how are Canadian Jews similar and different from American Jews. I have discovered moving here that lots of Canadians feel in the shadow of American culture and American media and American political debate, and I think unfortunately a lot of Canadian Jews, without the kind of data that the American Jewish community had, are actually not accurately reflecting the true diversity of their own community, which we discovered. So I'll screen share a couple of really important things. I really think you guys should, if you're interested in learning more about the Canadian Jewish community, go to the website. It's a 92-page report. It's enormously thorough. I'm going to skip through the big headlines. There were two big takeaways. Basically, yes, Canadian Jews are very different from American Jews in almost every way you can count them. Do they see themselves as religious or cultural, or is it family? How do they participate in Jewish life? All those questions, Canadian answered very differently, and that made Canadian Jews feel really good. But there was one way, and only one way, that Canadian Jews were, in the language of this survey, remarkably similar to American Jews, was the way they answered the Israel questions. When I moved here from the United States, the people the New Israel Fund of Canada leaders and staff and community, other Canadian Jews all told me, we are more right-wing than American Jews on Israel. And then this study came out, and the answer was, actually, we're not. So
I thought the Jewish community have a complete agreement on the 100% everything Israel do is right exists.
No, let's get into it. I'll show you what I mean. Here, okay, so I'm going to share, this is the Environics study, and I'm going to skip ahead to some like eyeball-catching questions here, and I'm going to zoom in so that people can see them better. For example, one of the questions that was asked on the survey was, do you believe that the Israeli government is making a serious effort towards peace? And do you believe that the Palestinian leadership is making a sincere effort for peace? And what you're looking at here are those two questions, the first question and the second question. The blue bar is Canadian Jews and how they answer the question. The red bar is American Jews and how they answer the question. And this is going to surprise you for two reasons.
Okay, go ahead with the surprise.
Look at this. This, in answer to your, we are all 100% marching in lockstep, and that we all believe that the government is puppy dogs and rainbows. A third of our community, a third of our community believes the Israeli government, and this was in 2018, mind you.
Which was Benjamin Netanyahu as well, by the way.
Yeah. Was not making a serious effort for peace. And I think that number was particularly shocking to Canadian Jews. A third of our community, and now, mind you, about half of them do, but it's not much more. And there's a bunch of I don't knows. Now, no surprise.
And the people who say no are larger than the number who say yes.
Yes. Now let's look at some of the other information. But I think that's an immediate takeaway. There's a big constituency of Jews who really don't think the Israeli government is making a serious effort for peace. And of course, their impression of the Palestinians is that no. And what do they mean by Palestinian leadership here? Is this the Palestinian Authority? Is this Hamas specifically? Does this include Hamas, which was still ruling the Gaza Strip at the time, at the time of the PLO?
The non-existent Palestinian leadership. And I agree. And to a large extent, that is probably, I don't think they are far off here. when it comes to whatever leadership we have. They're probably correct. But it is shocking to me that if I have 10 Israelis in the room, 4 or 5 would agree, half almost, close to half would agree
Canadian
with
Jews, you
most
mean?
Arabs that Israeli government is not working for peace. They're not serious. They don't care.
Yeah. Not Israelis. You mean if you're in a room with 10
So
Canadian
I'm,
Jews?
I'm in a room, yeah, with Jewish Canadians, right? So
Yeah.
so as Canadians, we sit in the room that like, this is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to tell a story where we actually understand that we are in this together if we focus on our Canadian values. That
Mhm.
and even if we disagree, even if I'm in the room with someone from the 35% who'd say we are trying hard to make peace and you're failing,
Mhm.
that discussion can be done in the same way you do it with people from your own community. That discussion does not mean we're enemies. Because
Yeah.
because I'm sure the Jewish community is not fighting each other over this either. Like it's an argument, but it's a valid argument to have.
Yeah, I think on from the outside, it really like the I know many of the much of the Jewish community is concerned about projecting a face of unity, but it comes from a place of intense insecurity because inside the community we know the single most um, uh, difficult issue is Israel. What do we do about it? Even if we all agree that it's important and should keep it, and that needs our support, we do not agree. We do not agree on how to go about it. This is the single most divisive issue in the Jewish community. You can get excommunicated from your in-laws. You can lose relation. People are losing relationships with their grandkids and their kids and their parents, and um, the a major outcome after every Gaza war. They happen like clockwork, don't they? Like every 2 years, there's a blow up or a war or something, and this is my like sixth Gaza war. As a professional working in the space, raising money for Jewish Arab Partnership and ending the conflict and things. Um, After every blow up, there is we get to that point where we're talking about like the Jewish community is unable to have a civil conversation with itself. People are so riven um, by the disagreement. And I think that is, people try to keep that pretty close to the chest. But I think actually quite the opposite. By showing that we're human and that we have a diversity of voices within us, by showing us that like we're a family like any other that, disagrees on stuff, I actually think we humanize ourselves. And we break the stereotypes that are really harmful to the Jewish community by saying, yeah. Let me show you a couple other ways that are that I think are a little bit surprising.
Yeah,
They asked this.
I think some of the things I said back then maybe the divisions between the Arabic and Jewish community is probably more dangerous than I thought they are, because if inside the same community these divisions can cause people to lose touch with each other, I would hate to imagine how would these divisions and these conversations could happen outside the community when when the
I
stakes are
think
even higher and the nerves are even hotter. And the emotional pressure right now is unbelievable.
it's unbelievable. I think I see it I'm less concerned with, I feel the like a false unity, like enforcing a false unity of something we don't agree with actually is enormously harmful to our community. And I think it's really important for us to be able to say that there are two sides to this conflict, but it's not Jews versus Palestinians. It's those who want to solve this through violence and those who don't want to solve it through violence. And that is partly the message of groups like Standing Together, the New Israel Fund supports, and their allies abroad. We can and should build a constituency in the diaspora that wants to get us out of this war, get us out of this conflict, diplomatically, you know, without having to resort constantly to military tools of any kind. Is
That that's definitely that's definitely. I mean, I not fully. I have a different take of what you just said.
mm-hmm.
I believe that I think what's happening is a major shift. I'm hoping. My optimistic view is that we have a major shift where the lines are being redrawn, like you said, where we don't just ally around a story or a mythology of a certain community or race or religion or the other, but rather align around human rights and equality. The most
Mm-hmm.
important thing is in Canada, I believe we have a good chance because we all enjoy the same rights in the land. And that land is by and large historically occupied from a native community.
Mm-hmm.
And we understand the meaning of reconciliation, of truth, of admitting what's happening, and we, to a varying degrees of success or failure, we at least trying to work our way through it. We're not burying our head in the sand. Sorry to
And I
interrupt you,
think,
but go ahead.
well, on that note, I feel like Canada. I've spent time working in the American Jewish community and the Canadian Jewish community, and there is one really interesting. There's a couple really interesting differences that I've felt make the conversation actually easier here. Quebec. Like Canadians have a lived experience of a nation within a nation, of what it means to have a political process that accommodates a nation within a nation. And then you add on top of it the commitment to Indigenous recognition here, the kind of conversations which are quite mainstream and are not that mainstream by
Of
comparison
course.
in the
Yeah.
States at all. But I think, you know, when we talk about, you know, group rights, national rights of the Palestinian minority of citizens inside Israel, or whether it's about the Jewish minority that could be in a Palestinian state, or the simple, basic model of a two-state solution. Those are really hard for Americans, especially Americans on the progressive side of the political spectrum, to get behind because their multicultural model is a melting pot,
Or,
and
or, or,
Canada.
or Israel in the Middle East. I mean, it's a country that speaks a different language, surrounded by all countries around it that speak a different language. And again, that example, like you said, you can have a nation within a geographic nation. You can have a nation within a nation within a nation. Sorry,
Mhm.
so let's get back on track a little bit. We got distracted.
Yeah.
Settlements in the West Bank.
Yeah, this I think follows the same bell curve as the one we just looked at. This is, you should know that like 23% of Canadian Jews believe the settlements are illegal by international law. That's not a moral judgment; it's a factual one, right? They're illegal by laws, and you can see an age breakdown here where if you're younger, that number is a little bit higher. Um, Still, like kind of like slightly more, like in this case, maybe less than twice that many, think that they're not illegal. And then you got a bunch of I don't knows. Again, like we're just trying to break up the monopoly that all Jews think the settlements are great and awesome.
It looks like, even from the previous one, it looks like 26% of the Canadian Jewish community is in the who the hell knows camp.
Because there's a significant debate within the Jewish community. These are partisans here, people who are saying that they are legal and people who are saying they are not illegal. Like there is an intense debate. People
Yeah.
trying to persuade each other and the non-believers or the unaffiliated. So let's go. I want to we'll roll into the next one, which is this one is I don't know if it's a moral judgment, but it's like a pragmatic judgment.
Yes.
That same
So, so,
question about
so,
illegal
so that's the
settlement.
difference between, is Hamas action October 7th contain war crimes or don't contain war crimes, constitute war crimes or not constitute war crimes? That's one argument. And the other argument is, was October 7th beneficial to the Palestinian cause, which is a much heated debate, I guess. That would
This
generate
is
a much higher level of controversy in the Arabic community.
Yes. And so here we have that, the like, is this a good idea? Are the settlements a good idea? Again, this is from 2018. And you can see the blue is Canadian Jews and the red is American Jews. You know, this is the leading one. Most American Jews and most Canadian Jews believe that settlements hurt the security of Israel, and it's several times the side of people who think it helps. So whether or not they're illegal, a bunch of people who think they're illegal, a bunch of people who think Canadian Jews who think that these are illegal, are a terrible idea.
Yeah, that seems like it's very interesting, right?
So I want to let's flip to. I want to dive in a little bit because I want to look at who are these progressive people who are answering this question on the progressive side. So here's that same graph. Basically, we just did it over again. So we've got the 39% who say it hurts Israel's security, and we've got the 14% over here who say that it helps. And there's a big I don't know, neutral, depends answer in the middle. But let's take just that orange bar and we're going to slice it out. Who are these Jews? This is a complicated graph, but it takes that same orange bar and slices it out into different segments of the community. So, which the different lines are the different religious streams of Judaism, in order from sort of like most religious to least religious. I don't like that framing, but I think that's how it translates.
The different line here, it looks like, so when you say traditional, conservative, liberal, non-denom, that's Jewish, just to clarify, this is Jewish religious denomination, not Canadian party affiliation. Conservative and liberal has a different meaning here.
Yeah, that's right. This is we'll get to the voting patterns shortly.
Yeah, but that's religious.
Yeah, this is a religious move. These are religious streams. So the liberal movements would be, say, the Reform movement, the Reconstructionist movement, the Humanist movement.
So for those of us who don't know that, like if in two words, traditional will be?
Traditional is Orthodox. Everybody from the people who wear a black hat to the people who are always wearing a white kippah.
You see them, you know who they are. Conservative?
Conservative and liberal look externally quite similar, but the real dividing line in these is around the flexibility within the movement of, well, when can you eat not kosher food? Well, can women have full equality in religious life? Like that's often the dividing line between those movements.
Okay, so in the Arabic community, that would be like the top guys would be like the Salafis, who look different, wear niqab, do the weird things. And then the conservative and liberal would be basically, like that. Conservative maybe will be like the traditional Islamic facing like Arab nationalist thing. Liberal will probably be like, I practice some things, but I'm a little bit free with my life. And then the yellow is non-denomination. Like that is...
It means unaffiliated. It's sort of a catch-all for...
Okay, so that's just culturally Jewish, but I don't play with any of these guys.
Yeah, it's a wide range. Wide range. And then we've stratified it by age cohort. Okay. And so I'm gonna say, like, if you were to walk, what this means is, if we look at the general trend here, the graph, the percentages is answering that question of the settlements unhelpful. Yeah. The trend is very high, answering that question at a very high percentage at the young ages. Yeah. It doesn't matter what religious stream it is, and it all slopes down. They all mostly they get less and less likely to believe that the settlements are a bad idea as you get older.
This graph, so I have background in statistics, faint background in statistics. This graph is really interesting because it could be a hopeful graph. If I flip this graph into not age, but look at it through time. Mm-hmm. So if like 30 years ago, if I asked, that would be the line around the 55, 64. These were the people who were 25 to 30 then. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right? And then I ask this question now, and if you flip it, you'll see the line of like thinking this is wrong increasing with time. It is just the new people, the new young generations, more and more. And I would love to have such a discussion in the Arabic community around what do we think of the two-state solution, where or do we or peace in general process, given that the Palestinians' rights are preserved and they have a fair and just. And I think it will be similar. It will be the older generation, the more conservative, are still on the line of no, this is a question of existence, not borders. And then as you go more and more and more, you will start to probably come. And again, in the Canadian context, because of the environment we live in, because of the people we see in the street and we work with. And
Absolutely. And I think there's especially I'm speaking just from within the Jewish community, like I'm an example. Like my parents are in their, they're in the 65 to 74 cohort. Like they're generally liberally leaning. They believe in the idea of accommodation with the Palestinian people. They just don't know how to get there. And they have a significant sense of distrust. Like we tried it our whole lives and we failed it. They're 70 something years old. They've had 70 something years of pain and disappointment. Yeah. I'm 40. I came to political awareness around this, in my early 20s. I've had only 20 years of pain and disappointment. And I feel like it's a different world with social media. Like we get a lot of different influences. Like if I want to meet a Palestinian, if I want to hear a Palestinian voice, how much more difficult was it for my parents to encounter such a voice? Even for me, at the dawn of the internet in my days of university, to just find other progressive Jews was an accomplishment, much less to leave my community and encounter views completely outside of it. So I just feel like the media environment is a part of, this does not mean that they are left-wing, this does not mean that they necessarily believe in the two-state solution. This just means that they are more critical and critically, they're more critical of Israel than their parents have been, right? And so I think
that's very interesting.
Especially because most of the decision makers and a lot of the philanthropic money and influence in our community is all held by older people. That's true for every community. This graph freaks them out.
Everybody
from their perspective, younger people are less pro-Israel.
And that's the crazy thing, because they may not be less pro-Israel. They may be pro-Israel in a different way.
Correct. Pro-Israel in a different way that may open up more willingness to compromise or to try new things or to give it a different, to go about it a different way.
But I think it's also important to highlight the fact that the role of progressive voices in communities is to build bridges between the communities, I think. Mm-hmm. And it helps explaining, because the conservative voices in different communities all around the world, everywhere, are always suspicious at best, if not plain out hostile towards disagreement, especially in a very tense environment like the one we're in today, emotionally exhausting, very traumatic. But it's the progressives who are always entitled with building that bridge and creating that connection in the middle and trying to explain to the conservatives of each side that there is a different way, there is an alternative. Because currently, what we have in our communities is nobody is talking of solutions. Nobody is talking of hope or a better tomorrow. Everybody is now talking about how horrific the crimes being committed. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to get into the comparisons of who's got more pain, because that's just not something I want to get into. But
I think it's important for your your listeners here to know that there is a core of dedicated Jewish activists, professionals, donors to organizations like the New Israel Fund. There's a few others that are active here in Canada, J Space, Canadian Friends of Peace Now. There is Heart to Heart, which is joint Jewish-Palestinian. There's the Friends of Standing Together movement. there is, what I hope people walk away with here is that there is a much bigger community inside the Jewish community of people who see Palestinians, who care about Arabs, who believe in the things you were talking about, human rights and equality. We have been pained for our own relatives and friends and colleagues in Israel, but we see you. We know you are there, and that we know that you feel the same pain. And there's been moments where I wished we could have, some of us wish we could stand more in solidarity with each other, and the polarization and the fear in our own community that we might be excommunicated in one way or another prevented us from being there.
Well,
Some Jews, sure, have gone to the ceasefire rallies.
yes.
But I want you to know that there's way more of us than the Jews who actually showed up to those, who inside our community still care about you.
And that makes sense.
Not
And thank you for saying that. Thank you for saying that, because that makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you look at the Palestinian march, I'm sure there are way more Arabs in Toronto that wanted to go to that Palestinian march that didn't make it. So I'm sure the number of Jewish community members who came to these marches to ask for a ceasefire or something, or the Ceasefire Now movement, and they've been more than welcomed and loved by everyone, which was comforting, at least, because I really hate the tension in the streets. But I want to also touch on something else now, and this is something maybe that the Jewish community may be helpful if someone is listening from the Jewish community. It's because you always get the question of, well, here you are, Ben, and you're building bridges and you're working and you're looking for voices to collaborate with you. Who are on the other side is doing that? And you always hear that question, right? And or I mean, I was in one of the marches during some of the worst times of the bombing campaigns, and I met a friend who was part of the Jewish Arab dialogue, and he was like, "Where are your progressive friends?" And it's such an unfair question to ask, because we are here and we're talking and we are doing our best, and you are on the ground working in Israel with people, helping Arabs, Palestinians who live in Israel, who are facing a horrific time and being oppressed, and they are facing a shifting political and social landscape, and you're helping them and you're doing everything you can. So it's such an unfair question from the Arab side to ask. And from the Jewish side to ask, we say, well, these guys, where were they from October 7th? And it's such a horrible question to ask, because most of the progressive Arabs I know will tell you there were a lot of criminal acts that happened during that day, and it was terrible, and it should not have happened. But then you pick who you listen to. I really can't thank you enough for that time you spent with us here. The work you guys are doing is incredible. It's very brave, and it gives me hope in Canada. I don't know about the Middle East. That's a different thing. I still have hope, but I am really focused on the Canadian situation. So I'm looking forward to talking to you again, and hopefully working with you and other progressive Arab voices to build more bridges between our communities. We definitely need them. We need to work together.
Ahmed, thank you for this invitation. I think the project you're doing is fantastic, and let's do more of it.
I look forward to it. Thanks a lot, Ben.
Thank you.
Thank you.